Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm going to talk about how to play Brewmaster Monk in Dragonflight Patch 10.1.5. There have been some very substantial changes to the way that Brewmaster Monks play in this recent mid-Season 2 patch, and actually getting a full grasp on how all these changes affect everything has taken me a couple of days, so sorry for the delay, but anyways, here we go. We'll start with the changes. The most basic stuff should probably come first. Tiger Palm and Invoke Nijao both received 50% damage buffs. The Nijao change doesn't matter, it doesn't really change anything, but the Tiger Palm stuff absolutely does, and it is the reason that Brewmaster Monks now sim around 100,000 DPS in single target, putting them well ahead of every other tank in raid except for Bear Druids in some situations. And of course, Bear Druids also received a similarly massive set of damage buffs with this patch. Additionally, Rising Sun Kick and Blackout Kick had their damage increased by 20%. This all makes Monk's single target damage very good again. Unfortunately, Keg Smash has not been changed, which means that Monks have actually lost ground compared to Druid and Demon Hunters in terms of AoE damage. Monk's AoE damage is still very good, but it's no longer overwhelmingly dominant. It's just really good. It's also still hard to play, whereas both Bear and DH are super easy and chill. There was also about a 7% total damage increase to Monk's abilities just across the board to offset the nerfs to the Onyx Amulet and Seal of Diurnus Chosen Rings. Onyx Amulet is dead, although Seal of Diurnus Chosen is actually still a very small DPS increase in single target, about 150 or so compared to a 447 crit verse ring. I would expect a second nerf to that ring in a couple of weeks, but if you have a 421 item level Seal of Diurnus Chosen, just keep wearing it in raid until that happens. It is worse than any sort of AoE though, so don't wear it in Mythic Plus if you have a decent alternative. I do not, so I'm still wearing it. But in a couple of weeks when I'm able to craft another ring, that's what I'll be doing. There were also several additions to the talent tree, as well as one very small but also very large change. Let's start with that change. The locations of Facepalm and Counter-Strike were swapped. Seems minor, but this is actually a huge buff for Mythic Plus Monks, since Counter-Strike, which is great in Mythic Plus, no longer requires pathing through Facepalm, which is worthless in Mythic Plus. It's also the exact same change for AoE raid fights, where you wouldn't want to use Facepalm, but you would want Counter-Strike. You know, same reasoning. And it's basically a non-change for single-target raid fights, since Facepalm and Counter-Strike are both extremely valuable for single-target raid DPS. Now as for the additions, here they are. 3 new talents have been added as choice nodes within existing talents. Dance of the Wind was added along Dampen Harm. It grants 10% base dodge chance and should probably not be used, although I have seen some people using it in Mythic Plus, and 10% dodge chance is okay. I wouldn't want to give up Dampen Harm to get it, but it's not illegal. Yu'lon's Grace was added along Diffuse Magic, and it grants a stacking magic damage shield based off of your max health every second. And it can potentially be useful as a passive magic defensive talent if you're feeling overwhelmed by keybinds, or you're dealing with constant but non-bursty spell damage where a short duration, 6-second massive damage reduction cooldown like Diffuse Magic wouldn't actually be that useful. If you're just taking a lot of spell damage over time, or like medium-sized spell damage hits all the time, then Yu'lon's Grace might be pretty nice. Finally, Press the Advantage was added as a choice node alongside Weapons of Order, and I could make entire videos about PTA alone, and maybe I will, but basically it works like Devastator from Prot Warrior or Demon Blades from Havoc Demon Hunter. Unfortunately, it was nerfed very late in the PTR cycle, and despite some incredible initial promise, we're talking over 500,000 damage Rising Sun Kicks, it has arrived to us as a dead talent for raiding. It died before it could live in raid. I've had to re-record a lot of this video because PTA is actually seeing use in Mythic Plus, due to it adding a lot of defensive value and sustained damage output at the expense of a ton of burst damage from Weapons of Order. It's definitely a weaker offensive talent than Weapons of Order for raid, but in Mythic Plus, it is a surprisingly decent talent. And I mean that literally. I am surprised. It's being used by a large number, like I think a small majority of Brewmaster Monks and high-level Mythic Plus. I didn't see that coming, I really didn't. But it's good. Finally, Blackout combo Tiger Palm has emerged as a very powerful offensive playstyle in single target raid situations. This is the new way to maximize your single target damage rather than press the advantage. And boy does it. Full best in slot Brewmaster Monks are currently simming for over 100,000 DPS in single target, which is pretty good. Alright, since this is a Brewmaster Monk guide, I do want to go through all of the usual stuff I do in one of these, give a full picture of how to play the class, but since a lot of stuff hasn't changed since the last couple of guides, I'll try to zip through some of the more mundane stuff. How does Brewmaster Monk play? It's fast-paced, it's high damage, and one of the harder bursting AoE damage specs in the game. They have an absurdly long list of offensive and defensive cooldowns, and their rotation is very complex. Not just for a tank, just complex for anything in general. I know this patch promised to simplify the class, I certainly hoped it would, but I literally think the opposite has happened. I think it's even more complicated now than it was before. It is strong though. The defensive toolkit is the best in the game for dealing with burst damage, so it's great at tanking and raids. The self-healing is surprisingly strong, but it's still not the strongest in the game, and so Brewmaster Monk does fall a bit behind Demon Hunter and Druid in Mythic Plus. Brewmaster Monks are really strong tanks if you can manage their enormous complex toolkit, and it's very satisfying, like emotionally or whatever, to figure them out as well, but they are pretty unforgiving when you're still learning, and because it is so complex, there is a lot to learn. I mean, I literally still feel like I'm learning new things all the time when I'm playing my Monk, and I have 440 days of playtime on Llarold, who is not my only Monk. I feel like I've basically dedicated my life to Brewmaster Monk, and I still haven't figured it out. And that's kind of depressing. Alright, what is Brewmaster Monk good at? Everything a tank normally does. They're great tanks. They're an omni tank. They are best at living through burst damage, dealing damage, and mobility. But they're good at everything. Now let's talk about their tier set. Your tier bonuses are simple, mostly passive, but very strong. The 2-piece bonus grants you 20% more damage with Blackout Kick and gives you a 10% chance to not reset elusive brawler stacks when you dodge. This is a substantial increase to the amount of sustained damage you deal, and it also is a pretty good increase to the amount of dodge chance you have just in general. It adds up to a lot of damage reduction over the course of encounters, and it's a really good bonus. I had to go back about a month in my logs to find this information because I've mostly been doing Rashok on alts for the last month. But the last time I did Rashok on my Monk, I dodged 80% of the auto attacks that came my way. So, you know, pretty good for reducing your damage taken. God, just imagine parrying 80% of a boss's auto attacks. Insane. The 4-piece bonus makes Rising Sun Kick grant a stack of elusive brawler. It also makes it so that when you dodge, the damage and crit chance of your next spinning crane kick or Rising Sun Kick is increased by 5%, and that stacks up to 5 times. These are both really good bonuses. They fix my main issue with Rising Sun Kick, which is that it doesn't have any defensive value by default, and they add a lot of damage and defensive value just in general, and decrease your average damage taken from auto attacks by a large amount. This is all great. They also don't have any kind of negative or confusing interactions with your rotation and talents. It's all just straightforward, buffs you, playing the way that you would want to play. Alright, now let's talk about talents. I have 4 talent setups I want to consider here: a Mythic Plus setup, 2 raid setups, one for single target and one for AoE, and a Press the Advantage setup that I'll go over since it's interesting even if it's not actually good numerically. This is my 3rd time re-recording this because, well, I went a little too long-winded in my previous ones, but also, things have changed in the time since I recorded the first round of this and the current one, and this is why this has taken a little while to get out, but on the other hand, I think I'd rather be, when I'm making a guide, slow and correct than fast and wrong. So let's just start with what has actually changed with the talent tree. And we'll start here with the Diffuse Magic and Yulon's Grace choice node that now exists, and the Dampen Harm and Dance of the Wind choice node that now exists. Basically, Blizzard has given monks of all specs the option of taking these active defensive cooldowns, Diffuse Magic and Dampen Harm, which are both amazingly powerful, or somewhat similar related passives. Yulon's Grace is pretty nice. It basically gives you a shield worth 2% of your max health every 2 seconds while you're in combat, and it caps at 10%. So this really counters one of the biggest disadvantages that Brewmaster Monks have always had, which is sustained spell damage. Brewmaster Monks are great with dealing with burst spell damage. You know, a big 500k Shadow Blast is coming in at your face from a boss. You hit Celestial Brew, maybe you hit Diffuse Magic, boom. You're not taking any damage at all. The problem, of course, is that Diffuse Magic is a 6-second buff on a 90-second cooldown. It's a huge damage reduction for predictable bursts of spell damage, but when you're just dealing with, like, a mob in a group that has a Shadow Bolt that he's blasting you with over and over and over again, and nobody's interrupting it because they have to hold their interrupts for bigger, more important casts in that pack, yeah, the Yulon's Grace could actually be a lot more useful there. So, while I still think Diffuse Magic is better in Mythic Plus, and more people are using it in Mythic Plus than Yulon's Grace, I think Yulon's Grace could be really good. We could see this wind up being a lot more popular choice once people get a little bit more comfortable with the idea of giving up their active defensive cooldowns. Similarly, Dampen Harm is just a great omni damage reduction cooldown. It's useful for everything. It reduces damage when you press it. It's pretty good. Similar to Diffuse Magic, it's 10 seconds on a 2-minute cooldown, so the uptime isn't very good. Dance of the Wind is dodge chance. It's only 10%, so it's not as good as some talents like Pretense of Instability or Training of Nizao or just, you know, Your Mastery. But it is a decent amount of damage reduction when you're in Mythic Plus. However, I think where Dance of the Wind benefits Brewmaster Monks, especially in Mythic Plus where you're being auto-attacked a lot, that Yulon's Grace doesn't, is you have a lot of things that scale offensively with dodging. You have Counter-Strike, which increases your next spinning crane kick by 100% after you dodge. You have your current 4-piece, which gives you 25% or 5% per dodge, up to 25% damage and crit chance on your next spinning crane kick or rising sun kick. You also have Charred Passions, which increases your spinning crane kick damage and is multiplied by all those other factors. So I could see taking Dance of the Wind in Mythic Plus as an offensive option. Obviously, you're giving up a very valuable damage reduction tool in Dampen Harm, and so that is a little bit hard to accept, but I could see people running both of these passives instead of either of the two actives for a lot of situations in Mythic Plus. I think for Tyrannical weeks, I would be maybe a little bit more scared to not have at least one of these for big boss spell damage hits, like the Molten Crash from, what's his name, the final boss in Neltharion's Lair. That hits very hard, and not having some sort of major defensive cooldown up for it can just one-shot you. But for Fortified weeks where you're getting auto-attacked and spell damage for a whole bunch, and there's not really all that much burst, it's just a lot of damage all the time, I could see running both of these. Over here in the right-hand tree, Facepalm and Counter-Strike swapped places. This isn't really a big deal for Raid. Either you take one of these talents, or rather, you take none of these talents or both. In Mythic Plus, it is a big deal, because you only want one. You want Counter-Strike. So now that you don't have to waste a talent pathing through Facepalm to get Counter-Strike in Mythic Plus, that gives you more points to spend it down lower. You can take Bountiful Brew and Bone Dust Brew, which now work much more forgivingly. Basically, previously the way it had worked was Bountiful Brew procs would reset you to 10 seconds of Bone Dust Brew, and if you use Bone Dust Brew over a Bountiful Brew proc, you would reset back to 10 seconds. Now you have a cap of 20 seconds of Bone Dust Brew uptime. That's the maximum. But if you throw Bone Dust Brew over a Bountiful Brew proc, it'll just add the remaining time. So 5 seconds of Bone Dust Brew remaining, throw Bone Dust Brew on, 15 seconds remaining now. Pretty nice. It also works the opposite direction. You know, you throw Bone Dust Brew on, it ticks for a couple of seconds, you have 5 seconds left in Bountiful Brew procs, you're back up to 15. This is great, and definitely worth taking even at the expense of one of those points in high tolerance, because it's just worth so much damage over the course of a run to have these 2 points, and so much damage reduction thanks to all of the brew cooldown reduction that it adds. In terms of choice nodes here, training in Zhao is just way better than light brewing. Better for damage reduction, better for damage output, better in every single way, and it has all these wonderful other synergies with dodging, so that's good too. Charred Passions, thanks to the Blackout kick buff in this patch, is better in all situations, and in Mythic Plus it is substantially better than Dragonfire Brew, so that's another must run in your choice nodes. Most of the other choice nodes haven't changed. The only ones that have are Black Ox Brew and Bob and Weave, which I now recommend Black Ox Brew unless you're truly uncomfortable with playing it, because it is another active keybind. I really prefer running Black Ox Brew. Just in general, being able to Celestial Brew 2 times in a relatively short span of time, 10 seconds pass after you've Celestial Brewed and suddenly you get bursted really hard, or a big spell is coming in that you need Celestial Brew to survive, being able to Black Ox Brew and Celestial Brew that and live instead of dying is really valuable. And Bob and Weave wouldn't save you in a lot of those burst damage situations. Bob and Weave is really just about reducing your damage taken over the course of time, and with stagger values not being as high in this expansion as they have been in the last couple, it winds up not being as good. Now, I've mentioned that Press the Advantage is very terrible in raids. However, it's actually getting used a lot in Mythic Plus, and this is kind of surprising to me. It really didn't seem like it was going to be good in Mythic Plus or AoE situations at all. I think the reason that it's getting used so much is really twofold. One, it just gives you a lot of steady brew cooldown reduction with your auto attacks. I'm seeing people using it with two-handers even though it's like 35% less effective than when you're dual wielding. I personally have used it with a two-hander, and I have to say, I did notice that I got a lot more brew uses available while running Press the Advantage than when I was just running Weapons of Order. Additionally, the added little bursts of damage and brew cooldown reduction from the bonus keg smashes is pretty good. It does add up to a lot of damage over the course of a run, and it is a sort of steady trickle of damage all the time, rather than the brief burst windows of Weapons of Order. The reason I still think Weapons of Order is better for the majority of players is, it is a great burst damage cooldown. You have the ability to stack up 4 stacks of Weapons of Order and then Exploding Keg over the top of it for 32% more damage. Everything else is doing more damage during those periods. So when you have a situation where you're doing a double or a triple pull, you can Weapons of Order once you have all those mobs together and add quite a bit of damage. But also you get that defensive value out of that mastery while you're doing those larger pulls. I would say that even if you are comfortable with Weapons of Order, happy with it, all of that, you should still try Press the Advantage out, because it's a pretty interesting difference in playstyle. I don't necessarily think it's actually that much simpler, because you do want to monitor your stacks and then use Keg Smash as soon as you've hit 10 stacks to kind of maximize the value of it. You're basically shifting the complexity away from when do you time using this major offensive and defensive cooldown into sort of a constant rotational state of awareness where you have to be monitoring the amount of stacks you have so that you can quickly consume those 10 stack extra keg smashes the moment they come up. It kind of requires a lot more moment to moment attention than the Weapons of Order playstyle, which I think is a reason why maybe this isn't as great of a choice for less experienced players, but it is still worth playing around with, and it does add a lot of defensive value, which is nice. Now, one thing I could see as a temptation for people if you were to switch to Press the Advantage is to drop that point in high tolerance and also run Chi Surge. However, you'll note that Chi Surge does massively less damage with Press the Advantage than it does with Weapons of Order, and it really doesn't actually wind up adding up to that much damage in AoE. I think that the defensive value and the little bit of stat budget that you get out of high tolerance is actually much more valuable. Really you're running Press the Advantage in Mythic Plus for the defensive benefit that it gives. If you wanted to maximize your damage output, you would run Weapons of Order anyway, and then do large pulls when it's available so that you can maximize its value. Press the Advantage is a defensive choice. All right, now let's go ahead and switch over to the AoE raid setup, and I'm switching to that before the single target because it is so similar to the Mythic Plus setup for obvious reasons. The main things that I'm swapping here are just in raid, you don't need detox. I'm taking improved Touch of Death just purely because it does enhance the usability of Touch of Death in raid situations, but you could run anything else. If you don't need Ring of Peace in raid and you want to be a nice helper for your group, you can run Generous Pour. You basically have, this is kind of the standard left-hand tree setup for raid. And then you really just kind of have two fluctuating points you can throw anywhere. You could throw them in Bounce Back if you want a terrible defensive layer. You could throw them in Generous Pour if you want to give a defensive value to your group. You don't want to put them in Save Them All because that doesn't work with Expel Harm, so it's functionally worthless. But you could do Improved Touch of Death and Improved Roll. You could do Hasty Provocation if you do feel like you need to move a boss around quickly. The only boss I can think of that I have needed Hasty Provocation for, truly needed it for, was Mythic Sarkareth Intermission, phase 2 to 3 intermission, but it is nice to have on Rashok, and really every boss it's nice to have Hasty Provocation even if it's not necessary. So anyway, this is kind of the standard AoE setup I'm going with in the left hand tree. In the right hand tree, I'm just running all the talents that you would use to maximize your damage output. So we're talking Training of Nizao as usual, Counter Strike is here, Blackout combo, and the idea would be that you would Blackout combo all of your Breath of Fires. And then we are running Chi Surge here, along with Weapons of Order, just to maximize damage there. No high tolerance, no pretense of instability, not really worrying that much about auto attack damage in AoE raid tanking. All right, now we'll go from there to single target, and this is where things get very, very different in terms of playstyle, but the talents really don't change that much. I have taken Eye of the Tiger here purely, again, because this is the two fluctuating talent points. Eye of the Tiger is insanely terrible for damage output. We're talking like 100, 200 DPS. Very bad. And even worse for healing. Really an awful talent. The only reason I would ever run this is if I had nothing else to spend those talents on. You also don't have to take Spearhand Strike in the raid setups. That's something that I did take in the AoE setup, but you don't have to interrupt anything in a raid fight. There's not really a reason to spend a talent point in it. It's kind of weird, and you don't want to get caught in a situation where, oh, I forgot to put my interrupt back in. I really don't care for that design, but here we are. The only notable talent that we've really swapped out here is I've dropped Stormstout's Last Keg for Facepalm, and I'll go over this more in the rotation section, but the reason is you're not actually using Keg Smash on cooldown if you're playing this single target Facepalm, Blackout combo, Tiger Palm playstyle. So there are points where Keg Smash is sitting on cooldown. And having that extra Stormstout's Last Keg charge and that extra damage doesn't actually add much damage. The difference in damage output between Exploding Keg and Stormstout's Last Keg from Sims is literally like 14 DPS. So you could run Stormstout's Last Keg for comfort if you really want. Instead of Exploding Keg, maybe you just want to cut down one extra keybind. That's not a problem. Or maybe whatever, maybe you want a little bit more comfort with Stormstout's Last Keg, letting you be able to Keg Smash multiple times while you're out of melee range on a fight like Magmarax or Rashok, where you kind of have to move the boss around a little bit here and there, and you might be forced out of melee range at some points, and that's like unavoidable. I can see doing that, but Exploding Keg is technically a little bit better for single target damage than Stormstout's Last Keg in the pure Facepalm, like Blackout combo Tiger Palm playstyle, where you're not trying to maximize your Keg Smash usage. It's still so alien to me to think about that, but the whole principle of this playstyle is maximizing Blackout Kick and Tiger Palm, and then everything else is filler in between. And this is what that ideal talent setup would look like for that. And finally, we have the Press the Advantage raid setup. I am taking Interrupt here just for whatever reason. And here we are. It looks very, very, very similar to the raid single target setup. The one difference here is You do want to take Storm South's Last Keg here. You're obviously taking Press the Advantage, and then you're taking everything that would buff Tiger Palm. So, Counter-Strike, Facepalm. You're using Blackout combo and using Blackout Kick to empower those 10-stack Press the Advantage bonus hits. So you're getting maximum damage on Rising Sun Kick, maximum damage on, well, really just Rising Sun Kick bonus hits. Ideally, you never want to use Keg Smash with this because this is a single target Press the Advantage setup. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Alright, now let's talk about abilities. You basically have 2 or arguably 3 rotations. You have the standard rotation, which maximizes your defenses in all situations, and your AoE damage. You have the Blackout combo Tiger Palm rotation, which absolutely does sacrifice some defenses in order to maximize your single target damage only. Third, you technically have the Press the Advantage rotation, but that's a bit more stripped down and kind of deserving of its whole entire section. I'll start with the normal rotation first, since it is way more useful. Like, if you only do Mythic Plus, this is basically the only rotation you'll ever play. You can play it 100% of the time even if you do raid, and it will be fine, but you will be giving up some single target damage in raids. That being said, the Blackout combo Tiger Palm rotation, BCTP, that is only for single target and only for maximizing damage, so you don't want to use it in AoE, you don't want to use it if you're worried about dying. Keg Smash, Rising Sun Kick, Blackout Kick, Breath of Fire, and Rushing Jade Wind are your 5 main rotational skills, and you want to try to maximize your usage of all of those once you've made use of your offensive cooldowns. One very important tip here is that Blackout Kick is actually the highest priority skill the majority of the time. You always want to keep at least 1 charge of Keg Smash on cooldown, but that's pretty easy. And after that, you use Blackout Kick ahead of Rising Sun Kick and Breath of Fire. This might seem a little counterintuitive since Rising Sun Kick deals more damage, but basically the reasoning is that if you always prioritize Blackout Kick in spots where you have multiple good skills available, you'll have way fewer points in your rotation where none of the good skills are available, and you're forced to hit Tiger Palm or Spinning Crane Kick as a sort of worst-case filler. Now, hitting those are fine. There are points where you just have to hit them, but they're filler skills, 1 for single target and 1 for AoE, and your goal should be to use both of them as little as possible, and hitting Blackout Kick as much as possible is how you achieve that. Using cooldowns can be a little bit complicated. The main rule of thumb for managing your offensive cooldowns and your rotation in general is to not let your abilities sit on cooldown. Now, you don't want to take that to the furthest extent of the law and okay, it's first global of the encounter, I have to throw Exploding Keg, and then I have to use Weapons of Order, and then Bone Dust Brew. You obviously can't cast all of them at once, for one, and prioritizing them correctly is important. But if you manage to at least use all of your abilities as much as you can and you don't lose any casts during an encounter, you're off to a good start. You have a ton of offensive cooldowns, and Touch of Death is the only one with any sort of really special usage requirement. You can use the rest of them as you like. Whenever possible, you want to try to overlap them with each other. This will make them do a lot more damage. For example, if you just open up by throwing Exploding Keg at an enemy, it might do 30,000 or 50,000 damage. If you cast Bone Dust Brew shortly before you cast it, and you've already applied Weapons of Order and gotten it stacked up 4 times, and you use an Agility Potion, and so on, you might be doing, 2 or 3 or 4 times more damage with that Exploding Keg cast than you would have if you're just throwing it out there raw. This means you have to think like a damage dealer when you're using your cooldowns as a Brewmaster Monk, which is fairly different for a tank. Another important note about Exploding Keg, it deals extra damage for every hit you land while its 3-second debuff is active, so before you cast it, you want to be sure that you've recently refreshed Rushing Jade Wind. Then you can throw your Exploding Keg out, and all of those Rushing Jade Wind hits will count as extra hits for the purpose of adding damage with Exploding Keg. You should also follow up by hitting Spinning Crane Kick, ideally 2 times in a row after you've Exploding Kegged, so that you can get the absolute maximum amount of damage out of that ability cast. Now let's go over your main defensive skills. You have Celestial Brew, which is just a big ol' absorb shield, and you should be using this whenever you need to mitigate big predictable burst damage from bosses and raids. They're casting Tank Strike, you use Celestial Brew, and then it doesn't eat up your whole health pool. When you're doing trash mobs in raid, or doing trash mobs in Mythic Plus, you can kind of just use Celestial Brew whenever you feel like you're about to take a lot of damage, or maybe you have taken a bunch of damage, you want to protect your health pool and expel harm to heal it back up. On the subject of expel harm, it's your main heal. If you're playing super defensively and taking a lot of damage, you can pretty close to use it on cooldown. You kind of treat it like a 5-second death strike. Just health drops, expel harm. Health drops, expel harm. Purifying Brew is your most commonly used defensive skill. It's your main damage reducer. It reduces your incoming damage. You can kind of think of it like a damage reduction skill that you use whenever your stagger value gets kind of high. There's a direct correlation between your health going down and your stagger being high. Your stagger only goes up if you take damage, and if you take damage, your health will go down. You know, it kind of makes sense. That's probably the question that gets asked the most: when should I use Purifying Brew? And, you know, basically when you feel like you would need healing, when you feel like you're taking a lot of damage. Even if you're just using it every 10 seconds because you haven't quite felt that out yet, that's still a pretty decent rule of thumb. You only remove 50% of your stagger, so it's something that you actually don't need to micromanage that hard unless you're playing it literally like the top 5 players in the world in Mythic Plus. There are huge diminishing returns on using Purifying Brew multiple times in a row very quickly, so like if you were to hit it 3 times in the span of 10 seconds or something, it wouldn't do nearly as much damage as if you were just kind of, or damage reduction, as if you're just kind of hitting it every 8 to 10 seconds or so. But again, anytime that you take a bunch of damage, hitting Purify immediately is a great idea. I would say that I treat it very similarly to Expel Harm. Now let's talk about defensive cooldowns. You have Fortifying Brew, you have Dampen Harm, you have Diffuse Magic, and Zen Meditation. You can also count Celestial Brew as a cooldown. I think I use it a little bit more rotationally than that, but either way, I've already talked about it. They're all useful. You can use Fortifying Brew and Dampen Harm. Basically, it's just generic defensive cooldowns. They're good for everything. Diffuse Magic is only useful for magic damage, but it is very strong for that purpose. And the cooldown is fairly short. And it also has a Dispel component where if you're dealing with, say, the final pull of Freehold, for example, has a very dangerous Dispel mechanic, the Oiled Blade. Maybe your healer's a little slow on it. It's a 75% Mortal Strike that lasts for 8 seconds. You don't really take a lot of spell damage in that pull, but if your healer's a little slow and you need to heal, you can hit Diffuse Magic, flick that debuff off of you, and be able to heal yourself again. Finally, Zen Meditation is by far the weirdest and hardest to use defensive cooldown, I would argue, in the entire game. It can be really good for mitigating some very predictable damage events, but you don't want to just sit in it since you won't be able to dodge or parry attacks while you're channeling, and you're not able to do anything offensively or any sort of active mitigation either. So basically the way that you use Zen Med is if you have a very predictable big boss spellcast like Rashok doing his enormous tank strikes, Zen Meditation is off the global cooldown, so in the last second or so before you get hit, you could hit Celestial Brew and Zen Meditation and take 60% reduced damage from that tank strike while also having a big shield for it. Definitely not going to have any problems living through that hit. I almost forgot the other defensive cooldown that Brewmaster Monks have, and that's Invoke Nizhao the Black Ox. He's not a baseline skill, but he is a talent that you're forced into taking, and his offensive value, even with the 50% buff with the 10.1.5 patch, is incredibly limited. He's very, very weak offensively. Basically just a cast that you use, like, if you want to add a tiny, tiny bit of damage, you can throw him out there instead of, like, a Tiger Palm or something like that. However, as a defensive skill, he eats up, I think, about a quarter of the stagger damage that you take, he will take instead, which makes him a somewhat useful defensive cooldown. He's up for 25 seconds at a time, which is a pretty good amount of time for a defensive cooldown, and he's not immensely valuable, but he can be pretty useful, especially when you're dealing with a lot of physical damage. He can really help you reduce the amount of actual damage that you're taking on a second-to-second basis, and that's pretty nice. He gives you a long, long window of defensive coverage, and we like that. Alright, that's enough about the standard rotation. Now let's get to the new and more interesting stuff. First off, how do you play Blackout combo Tiger Palm, or BCTP, correctly? Basically, you spend every single BC on TP. Alright, thanks for watching! Okay, so the way that this actually works is that you have a couple of rotational windows. Blackout Kick has a 4-second cooldown, and you want to use it on cooldown from the start of the fight to the end of the fight, with a lot of exceptions for movement and the very opening of the fight where you're actually getting the boss in a melee range, and any times that you need to use defensive skills like Celestial Brew and Expel Harm so that you don't die. The idea is to use Blackout Kick every 4 GCDs, exactly 15 times a minute. And every time you do, you want one of the 3 GCDs in between to be Tiger Palm. This is harder said than done, because it requires breaking free from everything you know about Brewmaster Monk, like the idea that you need to keep Keg Smash on cooldown all the time, not true in this situation, or the idea that you need to spend all your offensive cooldowns immediately. Also, no, they need to be layered in. No, it's just Blackout Kick on cooldown, Tiger Palm once and only once every Blackout Kick cycle, fill the other 2 globals per Blackout Kick cycle with important skills. Repeat that permanently until the boss dies, and you'll be able to do an absolutely insane amount of damage. Now, as for how you handle this playstyle, it changes a bit from moment to moment because some of your skills interact with Blackout Combo and some don't. You never want to use the skills that'll steal Blackout Combo before Tiger Palming, but you don't want to let the ones that won't steal Tiger Palm sit on cooldown any longer than they need to. Keg Smash and Breath of Fire both steal Blackout Combo, Purifying Brew and Celestial Brew will as well, and that's why this playstyle is a bit at odds with your defensive priorities, but whatever. Rising Sun Kick and Rushing Jade Wind don't. So it creates basically 2 different cycles that go like this: Blackout Kick, Tiger Palm, Keg Smash, Breath of Fire. That's sort of the A cycle. Blackout Kick, Rising Sun Kick, Rushing Jade Wind, and then Tiger Palm is the B cycle. Now, depending on your haste level, you may be able to perfectly rotate between these 2 cycles indefinitely, AB, AB. I'm at less than 2% haste, so I cannot. After a couple of cycles, Rising Sun Kick is on cooldown when I get back to the B cycle, so I just kind of have an empty GCD there. I could fill it with a cooldown like White Tiger Statue or Bone Dust Brew or something like that, but it's important not to spend it on a skill that costs energy like an unbuffed Tiger Palm, because this playstyle is very aggressive with your energy consumption. Unlike the vast history of Brewmaster Monk's energy, it's actually an important resource you want to manage. I had to use Black Ox Brew purely to restore energy at some points because I had misplayed my rotation and couldn't use my most important skills. Having less than 2% haste definitely has something to do with that too. Literally, even just 1 piece of haste gear would make this a lot more forgiving, so I guess it's not the end of the world to get a bit of haste somewhere, even if it might sim as a DPS loss. The other problem with this AB repeat cycle of play, which I think requires 20% haste for it to like really lock in, probably more like 30% haste for it to like fully permanently work, it's quite a bit of waste of your stat budget. And while it does work very well on a training dummy, in actual gameplay you have to use Expel Harm and Celestial Brew to stay alive, and they absolutely throw a big old GCD-shaped wrench into your perfectly structured rotation. There's also movement, which completely interferes with your ability to maintain that state of metronomic precision with your rotation either. So it's absolutely not as perfect in practice as it is on paper. In terms of how to prioritize your skill usage, there's a very valuable metric in Sims called damage per execute time, which basically is like damage per cast time. And it's basically a measure of how much damage a skill does for the amount of time you spend casting it. Since everything a monk does is going to be a 1-second GCD, the cast time's all the same, so major cooldowns like Weapons of Order and Exploding Keg would logically be up at the top. Rising Sun Kick is your number 1 normal rotational skill, with Tiger Palm and Blackout Kick as number 2 and number 3, which is why they dominate this entire rotation, because they're very short cooldown. Well, Blackout Kick's a very short cooldown, Tiger Palm is no cooldown. And depending on your talent setup, Keg Smash will either be 4th or 5th among rotational skills, with Breath of Fire either right above or right below it, and Rushing Jade Wind will bring up the rear. If you use Storm Stout's last Keg, Keg Smash will be ahead of Breath of Fire in terms of importance, both as a damage and a defensive skill. If you go with Exploding Keg, which is the more normal setup, then Keg Smash is actually less value offensively than Breath of Fire. In either case, Keg Smash, Breath of Fire, and Rushing Jadewind all go tumbling way down in value in this playstyle, which really requires a major mindset adjustment compared to the way that we've been playing Brewmaster Monk since Legion at least. I would argue maybe all the way since the very beginning, other than Breath of Fire wasn't really very useful prior to Legion. In conclusion, Blackout Kick and Tiger Palm, they're the ultimate team. They're the path to maximizing your damage. If you maximize those, then maximize your cooldowns and your Rising Sun Kicks after that, and then focus on Keg Smash, Breath of Fire, and Rushing Jadewind accordingly, your damage output will be great. Both the Exploding Keg and Storm Stout's Last Keg setups work fine. Exploding Keg is a better source of burst damage for your opener, of course, so it's always very good. Storm Stout's Last Keg may trick your brain into trying to play the AoE playstyle, which is a DPS loss, so maybe not running it is ideal for just keeping yourself in the right mental state to play this very different playstyle, because again, just in case I haven't made it abundantly clear already, keeping Keg Smash on cooldown all the time is not the priority in this BCTP playstyle. It's still hard to break free from that. It is kind of nice to have Storm Stout's Last Keg if you have to move out of melee range, or if you're doing a fight like Neltharion or Sarkareth that's mostly single target, but then suddenly has extended AoE sessions where you can Keg Smash and do the normal AoE rotation where instead of Blackout combo Tiger Palming, you're Blackout combo Breath of Firing and Keg Smashing, keeping that on cooldown, and Tiger Palm completely falls out of the rotation. Exploding Keg is definitely better for big burst damage in those situations, but the difference is typically so small that you can kind of just play whatever you're more comfortable with, whatever you like, and RNG on crit chance will probably have more of an impact in terms of your total damage output than that one particular talent choice will. Alright, now let's move on to Press the Advantage. First things first, we'll go over how it works. It's a passive talent that replaces Tiger Palm and adds a bonus onto all of your main hand auto attacks. It works like Devastator for Prot Warriors or Demon Blades for Havoc Demon Hunter. It works whether you hit or miss, which is very strange, only talent in the game that I'm aware of, but that is good. The bonus has a few effects, a lot of them. First off, it just deals damage. Second, it reduces your brew cooldowns by half a second. And it buffs you with a stacking buff that grants 1% more damage per stack up to 10 stacks. Once you're at 10 stacks, using Rising Sun Kick or Keg Smash will consume the buff and cause your Rising Sun Kick or Keg Smash to cast 2 times, with the bonus cast getting a buff from all of the bonuses that affect Tiger Palm. So we're talking Face Palm, Blackout Combo, Counter Strike, and that's it. This effect is massively reduced, and that reduction was the last change made to PTA on the PTR. It is the reason that this talent isn't the go-to setup. Before the Tiger Palm bonuses were nerfed, you could regularly hit 300,000 damage bonus Rising Sun Kicks without any kind of raid buffs. I've been told that the highest score was way over 500,000. That's insane, of course, but the nerf was very heavy-handed, and bonus Rising Sun Kick crits under 100,000 are pretty much standard now, which leaves this talent setup doing more than 15,000 DPS less than the BCTP setup. That's not great. It does about 20% less damage than a normal Weapons of Order setup in AoE as well, which is also not great, but there are some people using it at the highest end of play right now, pushing plus 28s, so I want to get that out of the way before I go on, because I know it'll rightly be a source of questions. So why is it getting used in plus 28s? Is it just that those guys are messing around? No. You can mess around in a 22 or a 25. The dudes using PTA to push to the highest possible heights of Brewmaster pushing are not playing around. They aren't even using the offensive Press the Advantage setup with Facepalm and Blackout combo and so on. They're literally running the standard Mythic Plus talent setup, super defensive, and just dropping Weapons of Order for Press the Advantage. Some of them are even using two-handed weapons, which are significantly worse than dual wielding in terms of generating PTA procs, since you just generate procs when you swing with your main hand and you swing a one-handed weapon about 35 to 38% more often than a two-handed weapon. It really just comes down to this. It's better defensively than Weapons of Order in that situation, and the damage loss isn't so bad that it actually makes the dungeons impossible to clear. It's a big damage loss, like 50, or in my case, just simming it, 60,000 DPS sustained AoE. But high level Mythic Plus is hardly so simple as one player's DPS number, and monks struggle defensively at the highest levels of Mythic Plus when they're playing the Weapons of Order setup. PTA, on the other hand, gives you lots of brew cooldown from auto attacks, as well as free extra keg smashes. Those keg smashes generate more brew cooldown too, and that all makes you tankier. And that's all that matters in high level Mythic Plus. So maybe you do 50,000 less DPS, but you can tank 3 more mobs at a time, and your group can do way more than enough damage to compensate for the damage that you personally have lost. Also, the extra keg smashes throughout pulls will probably help with holding threat more than the upfront burst of Weapons of Order, even if they aren't close to competitive with each other in terms of max damage. With that out of the way, let's move on to how you should play Press the Advantage. First, should you? In Raid, no. It deals massively less damage than a standard setup in AoE and a lot less damage than Blackout combo Tiger Palm in single target. We're talking about a 15 to 20% damage loss. In Mythic Plus it is tankier, so I would say maybe. If you're pushing high level Mythic Plus, yes. But if you're not in a situation where your defenses are being tested, pushed to their limits, then probably not. I think I would rather just have the burst damage from Weapons of Order. In terms of complexity, I would argue it's harder than other monk playstyles because unlike BCTP, in which you have to rewire your brain to use your skills in a different order, but you are still using skills all the time, PTA requires you to monitor buffs and gauge whether or not to use abilities or hold them for a 10-stack buff. Downtime becomes not like a failure or a flaw in the rotation, but an intentional feature. Doing nothing is a deliberate rotational choice that you make to increase your damage output. Auto-attacking becomes a skill in your rotation. That's absurd. The main wrinkle is that you need to be watching your PTA stacks vigilantly. Whether you're using a Weak Aura or some other add-on to track them, you need to be watching them. If you're at or below 6 stacks, you can play as normal. Once you're above 6 stacks, you need to plan out your rotation more carefully, because as soon as you hit 10 stacks, you want to use an empowered Rising Sun Kick if you're in single target, or an empowered Keg Smash if you're in AoE, and you want that to be buffed by Blackout combo too if you're using Blackout combo. You don't want to be sitting at 10 stacks waiting 6 seconds for Rising Sun Kick to come back off a cooldown. That's a massive DPS loss. You don't want to accidentally Keg Smash your 10 stack buff in single target either. That would be an even bigger DPS loss. You don't want to send your Rising Sun Kick or your Keg Smash without using Blackout Kick to get Blackout combo either. And you don't want to be in a situation where you're at 10 stacks, RSK is ready, you have to wait for Blackout Kick to come back up to get Blackout combo. None of those are great. So here's where things do genuinely get super complicated, because your swing speed is affected by your weapon type and your haste, and the cooldowns of Rising Sun Kick and Keg Smash are reduced by your haste. So the point at which you hold your Rising Sun Kick or your Keg Smash in order to use it with 10 stacks right on the dot changes according to your haste, your weapon type, and so on. If you're dual wielding, you want to hold Rising Sun Kick generally once you're at 7 stacks or more. For two-handing, it's 8 stacks or more. This is complicated by 2 more factors. You may be using High Tolerance. If you are, that'll give you up to 5% haste per point. If you're using 2 points, that's up to 10% haste that fluctuates based on your stagger value. Second, Wind Fury Totem gives you a 20% chance when you auto attack to do an extra attack. Wind Fury procs also trigger PTA. Are we having fun yet? Anyways, here's the conclusion on all of this. Press the Advantage reduces the number of keybinds the class uses, but increases the complexity. Its damage output is subpar, but it does have some redeeming defensive qualities, which is why it's being used in super high level Mythic Plus. I do think it's at least a fun change of pace, even if it's not a numerically good one right now. I also think, just from a defensive perspective, you can talent into it, make absolutely no rotational changes from the way that you've been playing prior to using it, and you will notice a defensive increase in Mythic Plus. You'll lose some damage, but you'll be able to tank more at a time, and your group can probably compensate for that. Using it effectively means you won't always push your Rising Sun Kick or Keg Smash on cooldown, whether you're in single target or AoE, you basically want to hold that keybind once you get between 7 or 8 stacks of PTA so you can empower it with that 10 stack buff before the next auto attack swing. And finally, if you're using Blackout combo, you always want to have that buff active as soon as your 10 stack PTA comes up so that you can get an empowered bonus hit. And finally, since I didn't mention it earlier, the Elementium Pocket Anvil does not work with this talent at all. It doesn't work with your auto attacks, it doesn't work with the bonus hits, it literally does nothing. Blizzard's aware of this. I personally reported it on the PTR a bunch of times. I know I'm not the only one. They haven't fixed it yet. I did go test it just before I started working on this. Maybe they don't care. Maybe they do care and it'll show up as a hotfix change in a couple of months. I don't know. Now let's talk about how to pull on a Brewmaster Monk. This is something I always specifically go over with every tank because pulling packs of mobs in dungeons can be challenging for newer players, and the start of a pull usually is the most dangerous point for a group. If you're running Rushing Jadewind, and you should be, this is something you want to precast before you run in. I mean, this is the reason why Rushing Jadewind is so good, as well as also just doing more damage than Special Delivery. Keg Smash should be the first damaging skill you use on a pack of enemies once you're in range. I like to use Bone Dust Brew fairly early in a pull, but not as the opening GCD. You know, if a group of enemies are standing in front of me, I don't want to throw Bone Dust Brew in to pull them because it doesn't generate any threat and it is on the global cooldown. So I'd rather hit them with some skills that'll generate some threat. You know, we're talking Keg Smash, Breath of Fire, Spinning Crane Kick, and I already have Rushing Jadewind precast. Then I'll hit them with a nice Bone Dust Brew and cast Weapons of Order and 2 Keg Smashes ready to go. That'll have you nice and locked up on threat, but it's really important not to use that Bone Dust Brew as the very opener because it'll pull everything but generate no threat, and mobs will start running around hitting your healer, eating up your mages. Nobody wants any of that. Once you do have all those mobs Bone Dust Brewed, Weapons of Ordered, all good and debuffed and locked up and stacked up, you want to hit them with an Exploding Keg and 2 Spinning Crane Kicks to get that humongous burst of damage. After this point, you can just unload the rest of your skills and proceed into your normal rotation. Getting Keg Smash and Breath of Fire up early in a pull is important just to ensure you've locked up threat and have your active mitigation up. Then you can blast your cooldowns and you'll be good to go. Alright, in terms of stats, Brewmaster Monks want to enchant and gem for versatility and crit. Crit is slightly better for damage output, but versatility is better for defensive value, and the balance between those two in terms of their actual damage contribution is relative. You know, if you have a lot of versatility on your gear, then crit may be better. If you have a lot of crit already on your gear, versatility could actually be better offensively. In either case, they're both your top 2 stats. Agility is very valuable, so whenever possible, you really just want to maximize your item level. In general, craft and gem and enchant for versatility and crit. With versatility, I think getting the edge a little bit over crit, but if you really want to maximize your damage, you can sim yourself out and maybe crit will be better for you. Because of the changes to Press the Advantage, haste is still a low value stat, although it can make the Blackout combo Tiger Palm rotation a little bit more forgiving in terms of energy management. If you have like a piece or 2 with haste on it, it's not the end of the world. Mastery is still a fine defensive stat, but not that competitive offensively. Alright, conclusion time. I didn't write anything for this, so I'm just going to riff off the top of the dome. Do I like Brewmaster Monk in this patch? Yes. I'm still disappointed by Press the Advantage not being nearly as good as everybody hoped it would be, including myself. I was kind of at the front of that. I didn't even care if it made the class more complex. Just the idea of removing a couple of keybinds and just having something new in terms of the gearing profile, the idea that you might actually want to have like 15 or 20% haste on a Brewmaster Monk is like a meaningful DPS increase seemed really, really cool. And then it got shotgun blasted in the face, and so it sucks now. And that's too bad, but there's still the possibility that it could be useful in the future. The current Blackout combo Tiger Palm playstyle is pretty fun for farm raid, for maximizing single target damage output. I mean, I'm definitely noticing that even playing it pretty poorly in raid this week, the damage increase is substantial. I don't think it'll really be that useful in actual progression rating. There are probably some situations where you could run that talent setup and sort of weave in and out of playing it to, let's say, mixed results. Like, I could see playing it half the time when stuff's just kind of not really that dangerous, and then as soon as things do get dangerous, you just default back to the more defensive play style until you've recovered defensively and you're able to kind of keep pumping damage output. I don't know, I guess we'll see. I'm really looking forward to patch 10.2. I'm definitely enjoying the ride along the way. 10.1.5 has been really fun, and yeah, looking forward to 10.1.7 and 10.2. All right, that is it. Thanks for watching. Bye.